New video just coming in showing Ukraine's bold drone strike on Russian aircraft. This is 2,800 miles from Ukraine's border, 2,800 miles. CNN's international diplomatic editor Nick Robertson is joining us. He's monitoring all of this from London. What can you tell us, Nick?
Very dramatic video, Wolf. I mean, you're just looking at it there. You can see how close the drones get to the aircraft. You can see at one point they sort of fly under the fuselage of the aircraft. You can see a missile attached to the underneath of one of those aircraft. We're looking here at the Tupolev 95, the long-range strategic bomber with, it has 4 big propellers on it, a workhorse of Russia's long-range strategic capacity to send fast missiles into Ukraine. So a major part of their work. But what you're looking at here, you can see these aircraft on the runway. This Tupolev 23, I think we're looking at here, which is one of the fast swept-wing fighter, if you will, design bomber, long-range strategic bomber jets. You're looking at vehicle tires, rubber tires placed on the upper body of these aircraft as if you were to sort of protect them from some kind of missile strike. We're also seeing here the Antonov 50, the AN-50, which is Russia's early warning aircraft system, a sort of an AWACS, if you will. Russia doesn't have many of these. The count over a year ago was about 6, and probably Russia's believed Ukraine has claimed to have shot down a couple of them before. So Russia doesn't have many of these. All of these were hugely valuable, but the drones get so close, you can not only sort of see the rivets, but you can see the screw heads where you would fit the screwdriver in to, you know, on the parts that of the wing and the fuselage. You see netting over some of these aircraft. We've seen plenty of video until now of all the explosions, but I think this just gives you a sense of how audacious it was, how much sort of in control of what they were doing, the Ukrainians were, that they had time to fly these drones, additionally not smashing into aircraft and blowing them up, but recording the event, getting detail of these important Russian jets on the ground. Again, just underscores the long reach, the out-of-the-box thinking, quite literally, that these were hidden in mobile cabins, if you will, and the audacity, again, of this type of attack, Wolf.
And a related question, Nick, very significant development. I'm now told that the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is not attending a critically important NATO summit meeting on aid, military aid to Ukraine in Brussels right now. This is the first time in, 3 years that a U.S. Defense Secretary has decided to avoid this kind of NATO-allied meeting. What's the significance of this?
Yeah, Lloyd Austin, the last Defense Secretary, was right at the forefront, chairing so many of those meetings in the past. And this has been noted, and people are asking this question. They asked this question of NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte this morning, and he sort of try to sort of pass over it, saying that Pete Hegseth, you know, scheduling is a difficult thing. He's in Brussels to have meetings with the NATO defense secretaries tomorrow, so he'll be there, part of that. So even NATO sort of trying to gloss over the impact of this. We had a very clear message from the US ambassador to NATO today, saying very, very clearly, when the leaders get together in 3 weeks' time, President Trump will be there, of course. He said that he's going. The expectation, the demand of NATO is that they commit 5% of their GDP to defense spending. This is a massive uplift, but he made it very clear that's the minimum the U.S. is looking for right now, Wolf.
All right, Nick Robertson reporting on the latest developments for us. Nick, thank you very, very much. U.S. and Ukrainian officials are meeting here in Washington as President Volodymyr Zelensky says more peace talks with Russia in Istanbul, Turkey would be pointless, his word, pointless, and he's calling for direct talks with Vladimir Putin. CNN national security correspondent Kylie Atwood is here with us in the Situation Room. Tell us a little bit more about these meetings.
Well, listen, I spoke with a senior administration official last night who said that Secretary Rubio in this meeting with Yermak today was expected to reiterate the posture we've heard from the Trump administration for the last few weeks now, that they like to see what Ukraine is doing in these talks with Russia. They like to see that Ukraine is effectively engaging. They think that is a productive posture. But the thing that they're not going to do in these meetings with the Ukrainians right now is get back to a place where Ukraine should expect unlimited military support from the United States. States for their war footing right now. And that's an important area for us to continue watching, because after meeting with Secretary of State Rubio at the White House, because he's now acting national security advisor, Yermak tweeted out that one of the things that they did discuss was the need to shore up support for Ukraine's on the air defense side. And that is one of the things that they're talking about with their European partners. It's very clear from this White House that they're not going to be the United States putting up that new support. So we'll watch and see where that comes from. But as you guys have been talking about this morning, this comes off the heels of that drone attack that Ukraine carried out deep inside Russia over the weekend. And a senior administration official yesterday said that that does put the situation in put the war in a situation where the risk is leveled up. And that's because obviously it took out some of those Russian nuclear bombers. But you haven't heard the administration warn Ukraine against those types of attacks. And that's really interesting, because they effectively believe that if Ukraine wants to continue fighting until there's a ceasefire, they have every right to do so.
Yeah, that's a significant development indeed, Kylie. Thank you very, very much, Pamela.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Kylie. All right, let's continue this conversation. Joining us now is retired General Wesley Clark, a former NATO Supreme Allied Commander. Hi, General Clark. Thanks so much for joining us. So what do you think? Do you think that these discussions will provide any significant movement in peace talks?
I doubt it, because what's missing is leverage applied by the United States against Putin. And as long as the United States withholds that leverage, either in sanctions or additional military assistance to Ukraine, Mr. Putin believes he's got a chance of deepening a wedge between the United States and European allies, letting Ukraine sort of slowly be strangled, and accomplishing his war aims. You know, Putin has had these aims. This wasn't just yesterday that he thought about this. This is years and years of planning and organization. So he's not about to be turned off on his aims unless he realizes he's going to really lose. He's not going to realize that until the United States weighs in more heavily than we have in the past.
All right, so let's look at this dramatic video just in that shows this Operation Spiderweb drone attack, where you can see Ukraine's bold strikes on planes deep inside Russia. What do you think about this video and just how brazen it shows that this attack was?
It's totally remarkable. It's an amazing tribute to the ingenuity, resourcefulness, courage, resilience, technological prowess of Ukraine. And Pamela, I've always thought, before the war ever started in 2022, that the toughest opponent Russia could ever face is Ukraine, because they understand Russia and they're inside Russia. And the truth is that Putin is not going to be able to eliminate these internal threats. In addition to this, there's reports of sabotage going on. There's train derailments, ships that can't leave port, bridges that collapse, and so forth. And it's only going to be intensified as the Russian structure is put under more pressure internally.
Well, and you had talked earlier about how you want the U.S. to be tougher on Putin. It is interesting that as it pertains to this attack, the U.S. hasn't come out to say, you know, Ukraine, stop it, or condemn it, right?
Well, there was a sort of passing comment from General Keith Kellogg about, oh, this is a nuclear thing. It could get into a nuclear business. Look, these are legitimate targets, and the United States absolutely must not condemn this attack. These weapons are being used against Ukraine to attack civilians, and Ukraine is going after military targets. So it's a totally legitimate attack, and thank goodness there's no strong U.S. resistance to this.
After seeing this video, I mean, how concerned are you that an adversary could do something like that in the United States?
It could be done. We are concerned about drones near our air bases. We do have technology to defend these bases. Whether it would be effective in every case, whether it's alert 24 hours a day or not, if I knew, I couldn't tell you and describe it in detail. We don't want that. But here's the thing, Pamela, except for the terrorists, we're not at war. So when you hear people say, well, what about the Chinese ships that could come in? Yes, China could do this, but it would be an act of war by a state. So for the United States, the real concern would be some Iranian terrorist or Al-Qaeda terrorists would have some drones there that could go after us. And so we do have to have protection around our air bases. We know that.
I wanted to talk to you about some reporting from our Nick Robertson that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is skipping this key meeting on Ukraine. It is the first time in 3 years that the Defense Secretary won't be at this meeting. What is your reaction to that?
Well, I'm disappointed, but not surprised, because Secretary Hegseth has all along said he wants to follow President Trump's guidance, reduce forces in Europe, get us out of the way, turn it over to the Europeans, focus on China. But here's the dilemma that the administration faces. If we aren't strong facing Russia in Ukraine, Xi Jinping sees it. He's an ally of Russia. He's feeding equipment and resources into Russia every day. He's got Chinese intelligence operatives on the ground in Ukraine looking at everything. So it's not that these are two separate theaters. They are interrelated. And to say or believe that you could sort of walk away from one and say, well, that's not too important, leave that to the Europeans, we'll look at China. Let's get realistic on this. We're not going to want to go to war with China. We have an active war that's a real threat to Europe. If we can deal successfully, stop this war in Europe, then we've got a better chance of managing the Pacific and not fighting a war against China. So there's a lot of elements of what Secretary Hegseth is doing that make a lot of sense. We do need more strategic defense in the United States. We do have to relook our procurement system. We've got to be more adaptable and so forth. But by golly, we have got to support NATO and Ukraine if we're going to have a safe and stable peace in Europe and a peaceful world.
All right, General Wesley Clark, always nice to have you on. Thank you.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says any further lower-level peace talks with Russia in Istanbul are, quote, pointless. The latest round of those talks was on Monday, and they concluded after only an hour with no virtual progress made. Now, Mr. Zelensky is calling for meetings with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Meantime, the NATO Secretary General is defending Ukraine's drone operation carried out deep inside Russian territory.
Let's not forget that the capabilities they hit were the capabilities the Russians were using to attack innocent people, going about their daily lives in Ukrainian cities and communities. So I think we really should take note of that.
The operation targeting Russia's air fleet was the first of the brazen attacks by Ukraine this week. CNN's Nick Robertson has more for us.
Ukraine's latest spectacular attack, targeting the Crimea Bridge, vital to Russia's war in Ukraine. 1,100 kilograms of explosives hidden underwater. A months-long operation, according to Ukraine's security service. It's not the first time Ukraine has tried to take out the 12-mile rail and road bridge that links mainland Russia to annexed Crimea. In 2022, Ukraine blew up the roadway, briefly disrupting Russia's flow of warfighting materiel. In 2023, Ukraine again tried to take out the bridge, pioneering new technology, a so-called Sea Baby, or water drone, hitting the bridge at water level. But the bridge held. The estimated $3.7 billion link was opened by Russian President Vladimir Putin in 2018, 4 years after he illegally annexed Crimea during Russia's first invasion of Ukraine. Roughly the size of Maryland, Crimea is hugely important to Putin, home to Russia's strategic Black Sea Fleet and a key hub in attacking Ukraine. Since his 2022 Ukraine land grab, Putin has also secured a land link to the island-like peninsula. Ukraine has vowed never to give it up. Ukraine's Crimea bridge attack comes days after another spectacular strategic strike, hitting Russia's long-range bombers at air bases thousands of kilometers from Ukraine. But on the grinding battlefront, Ukraine is incrementally losing ground, nowhere faster right now than around the northern city of Sumy. Russian artillery now so close, they are striking the city centre. At least 4 civilians killed, about 20 injured Tuesday, according to city officials. With peace talks effectively deadlocked, Ukraine's strategic moonshots definitely a boost for morale and a hint they still have some hidden cards to play. But this, as Putin seems intent to ignore President Donald Trump's calls for a ceasefire. Putin opting instead for a war of attrition. Nick Robertson, CNN, London.
All right, we have new video just in showing the beginning of the operation on Russia's air bases. These are the trucks used to smuggle in the drones that were then used to carry out the attack. The operation underscores just how critical drones have become in this war. My next guest writes about military technology. He is the author of Swarm Troopers, How Small Drones Will Conquer the World. David Hambling is joining us now live from London. David, great to have you with us. And I just want to show some of the footage coming through directly from the drones. And I think it's pretty fascinating, this first-person view. When you see just how incredibly sophisticated this has been and the technology behind it, and you've written about the sophistication of Ukrainian drones, how are you characterizing this wide-ranging attack?
I very much have a feeling of I told you so at this point. I mean, this attack was something special in that this was carried out by the security services of Ukraine, the SBU. So this is more like an intelligence agency operation than a military one. So it was, as you saw earlier, it was a Trojan horse. The drones were smuggled through to close to the air bases concealed in the roofs of mobile homes on the back of trucks, and they were then launched from there. So this wasn't a conventional military operation at all. But the technology is very much what we've seen in use before. So you've got these small FPV drones. These are like $500 racing drones, each carrying a small warhead and directed remotely by an operator. In this case, they did it from thousands of miles away using the Russian mobile phone network. So they're just making very clever use of existing technology to create very dramatic effects. From what the SBU tell us, they had 117 drones in the operation, and they claim to have destroyed 41 Russian strategic aircraft. That's not confirmed, but the numbers look about right.
You know, saying that it's like a Trojan horse is a perfect way to describe this, because they were wooden mobile homes. They were able to infiltrate the borders. They weren't picked up. They were using Russian cell phone networks. So what kind of advanced technology was used to be able to hide and not be picked up by Russian authorities, or even just in the least by Russian telco companies?
I think a lot of this was old-fashioned tradecraft, but on the mobile phone thing, it is very, very difficult for either side to completely shut down opponents from using their mobile phone systems. In fact, the Russians have been doing something quite similar with their Shahed long-range attack drones. Some of those have been found to have SIM cards which are connecting to the Ukrainian mobile phone system, and they're using that to gather intelligence, because that's actually the Russians' best way of finding out where their drones are, is by using triangulation from towers. So both sides are using these mobile phone networks. And unless you simply shut down mobile phone usage entirely, it's very difficult to stop nefarious people from using them. And so this is something that people are learning. But in terms of technology that is likely to be advancing on the back of this, this was an old-fashioned attack in the sense that it was carried out by human operators. Ukraine has already got AI drones out there which are capable of doing this kind of thing without needing a connection to any human. So you simply need to put a drone in the right area for the attack, and it can go off and find a target itself. Those are already being seen, and I suspect as the Russians clamp down more on mobile communications, we'll see more of that type of thing in operation.
So, you know, you've also written about the importance of drone warfare in this new era. And frankly, Ukraine produced around 1.2 million drones last year. The target, from what we understand, and according to Forbes, is 4.5 million drones for the year of 2025. How important are drones, and basically simplistic, this sort of traditional way of approaching it, but also geared with AI tech and so forth, going to be in changing fundamentally the calculus between Ukraine and Russia?
They are already incredibly important. I mean, there's a lot of numbers flying around, but according to some of the best estimates, there's at least 65% of casualties are caused by small drones at this point. Now, when you look at that, that's 2/3. So that means that small drones are causing twice as many casualties as everything else put together, twice as much as artillery, missiles, machine guns, tanks, rockets, the lot. So they are already incredibly effective. And as you say, Ukraine, having ramped up its drone production very dramatically in the last year, is now ramping it up further. So that will now, there will now be at least 3 times as many drones around, and they will be significantly more capable, particularly with things like fiber optic communications, which means they can't be jammed, and artificial intelligence on board, which makes them a lot better at finding and hitting targets. So they're likely to become even more important on the battlefield and beyond in future.
David Handling, great to have you with us. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. Good to have you on the show.
Thank you very much.
Another attention-grabbing strike against Russian targets. The latest example just today, Kyiv claiming responsibility for this underwater explosion, which it says damaged part of the road and rail bridge to Russian-occupied Crimea. This follows the stunning drone strikes on nuclear-capable strategic bombers deep inside Russian territory and raises all kinds of questions about the future, not just of this war, but warfare in general. I want to talk about it with retired 4-star Army General Stanley McChrystal, has a new book out on character choices that define a life. And I want to ask you, General McChrystal, about some of the choices in your book and the lessons in your book, because there are many about leadership and about character. I do want to get your reaction first to this extraordinary drone attack against Russia deep inside against the strategic bombers. Did it surprise you that they could pull something like this off? And what does it say about the future of warfare?
Well, it didn't really surprise me because the Ukrainians have been pretty innovative. But the future of warfare is the ability to do this kind of thing very, very deep. And I think what they've done is they're raising the cost for Putin. About 1 million Russians have been casualties already. They're raising the cost in strategic assets. And I think they're just trying to convince him at some point this is not worth the effort.
I know the U.S. is learning a lot about this new form of warfare by what's happening in Ukraine, but is the U.S. military ready for this form of warfare?
Well, if we get very honest with ourselves, think of the places we have bombers parked, accessed around airfields. Think of what it would take to do this in the continental United States or some of our forward deployed locations. We are pretty vulnerable by the nature of the way we have fought wars for about the last 80 years. So we have got to be going to school on things like counter-drone operations, but also controlling the entire area around it. Because you see, around those airfields in Russia, in fact, all they had to do was get tractor trailers in the vicinity, and then it became almost impossible to stop those. So it widens the spectrum of the threats you've got to deal with. And we've got a lot of high-value assets that are extraordinarily expensive.
Joining us now to discuss, CNN national security analyst Beth Saner and retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton. Colonel, Russia's been embracing this grinding war of attrition for years now, literally for years. But given these showy surprise attacks by Ukraine this week and Russia's recent advance near the key northern Ukrainian city of Sumy, do you think Russia is shifting its strategy?
Well, so far, no, Jake, because they think that they can use that war of attrition to actually make progress. And basically, in their view, all they need to do is move forward as much as they possibly can, force the Ukrainians off of their land, especially in the Sumy region, but also in the eastern part of Ukraine and the parts of the Donbass that the Russians have not occupied yet. So what the Russians are trying to do is they're basically trying to continue with their war of attrition. But those spectacular attacks, the one on the Kerch Bridge and the one affecting the air bases, they send messages, they make headlines, and they really have an impact basically on the morale. So it then comes down to the idea of how much momentum the Russians can sustain and whether or not these attacks are actually going to affect the Russian strategy. So far, it hasn't affected it, but they might affect it in the future.
So, Beth, George Beebe, a former director of Russia analysis at the CIA, was interviewed by Foreign Policy magazine about the Ukrainian drone attacks at the Russian airfields. And he said, quote, "Unless Putin has a strong assurance from Trump that this attack is something that the United States opposes, then the Russians are going to be more likely to respond quite forcefully. There's no question that it increases the likelihood of a direct confrontation between the United States and Russia, unless the Trump administration takes active steps to defuse this. Do you agree with this analysis?
Not really. I think that that is something that certainly Russia wants us to believe. And it's certainly something that the MAGA base wants us to believe. But I think that Putin's last interest here is to have a direct confrontation with the United States and to have a direct war with NATO. That is not in his interest, especially because, as Cedric says, he does believe that ultimately Russia will prevail. And so, right now, this is a war about narratives as much as it is about this incremental progress on the ground. I'm still of the mind that things are not significant enough to actually change the strategic position of either side.
Colonel Leighton, you compared Ukraine's attack to the U.S. bombing of Tokyo during World War II, which was Operation Doolittle. Do you think Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb will be remembered as pivotal, not just in this particular war, but in 21st century warfare in general?
It definitely has the potential of getting to that level, Jake. And one of the key aspects of this is, what is the follow through going to be? What are the Ukrainians going to be capable of doing? When we attacked Tokyo, with the Doolittle raiders, we had a follow-on effort that, after several years, actually ended up with the capitulation of Japan. That won't be the case when it comes to Ukraine versus Russia. Russia will not capitulate in that same way. But what can happen is that the Ukrainians can use this not only to gain momentum, but also, as Beth said, this is part of a PR war. And if they get the PR on their side, if they get the support or continue to get the support from the West, whether it's Western Europe or the United States, or preferably for Ukraine both, then they have a chance of at least protecting their sovereignty. And that's really what their goal is at this point.
Beth, Ukraine hit Russian planes on Sunday, planes that are capable of carrying nuclear weapons. It's worth remembering at the end of last year, Russia updated its nuclear doctrine to lower the bar, lower the threshold for potential use of nuclear weapons. We know that Putin loves to rattle that nuclear saber. But are you concerned at all that these surprise attacks, successful aggressive attacks, might push Putin closer in that direction of using nukes?
This is always a risk, right? That is there. It's not going to be zero. I think, though, we have to get to a point where Putin actually feels, a more existential threat, or a threat of a line collapsing, which is what we had seen, several years ago when we got, where the intelligence community was saying it was fairly, it's 50-50, by some estimates of whether they would go that route. I don't think we're there right now at all. So, but we can't dismiss it, but I think we shouldn't buy into terror.
Colonel Leighton, Beth Sanner, thanks to both of you.
Russia's chief security officer is now in North Korea to discuss with Kim Jong-un the war in Ukraine. That's according to Russian state media. North Korea has sent, as you remember, thousands of troops to bolster Putin's war effort there. It comes as Ukraine's foreign minister now says Russia has yet to respond to Kyiv's peace proposals, despite Kyiv's negotiators giving them to Russia before their meeting on Monday. This really is turning out to be a hugely consequential week when it comes to this war, starting with that unprecedented drone attack Ukraine launched deep inside Russia, targeting air bases in multiple regions this weekend. And then yesterday, Ukraine claiming it bombed a critical bridge linking Russia to Crimea. And here in the United States, there's growing momentum right now around a bipartisan effort to slap huge new sanctions against Russia, something the president has not endorsed. Not yet endorsed, at least. Here's the majority leader, John Thune.
I wouldn't say that he's there yet. I think that they're aware, obviously, that we have a bill and that we're ready to move. So we will.
Joining me right now is one of the senators leading this sanctions bill effort, fresh off a trip to Ukraine to meet with President Zelensky, Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut. Senator, thanks for coming in. You met with Zelensky on Friday, I believe. This was your 7th trip to Ukraine. What did you see this time that you hadn't before?
What I saw first and foremost was the maps and some of the intelligence that indicate that Ukraine, far from losing this war, actually can win it. The maps and intelligence are going to be on display in just a little while here at the Capitol with two of President Zelensky's top security officials coming to brief all of the Senate. All senators have been invited by Senator Graham and myself to hear and see what we did just last week, indicating the audacious and bold, brilliant move in attacking the Russian airfields was just one card that Zelensky and Ukraine have to play. And the second point, which is very important, is that Putin has begun a massive invasion, really a re-invasion or summer offensive. And so the sanctions bill is all the more critical right now. That's why we hope to move forward with these scorching levies and sanctions that, in effect, would put Ukraine, the economy of Russia, on an economic island. In effect, stop the kind of aid that China has been providing that fuel the Russian war machine. And so this sanctions bill is very important at this moment in history.
I want to ask you more about that in just one second. But the White House confirmed yesterday that President Trump was not informed ahead of time about Ukraine's drone attack on those Russian airfields that you're talking about, that you're going to be hearing more about when you brief senators. Did you get a heads up? I mean, since you met with Zelensky and his team really just hours before it happened?
There was no indication about this specific operation. Keeping it under wraps in the way that they did was one of their major accomplishments. Putting those drones deep inside Russia ranks with the United States Bin Laden raid and the Israeli pager operations, one of the great special operations maneuvers of all time. But the secrecy was also an accomplishment, even as the president, as you'll remember, demeaned and baited Zelensky in the Oval Office about how he had no cards. Well, he has some very good cards. And what I hope to hear from this top team later today that my colleagues will also hear is some of the plans for the future. And I will say, Kate, in response to your first question, what I also saw in Ukraine was some of the children who have been abducted and kidnapped. I met with them personally. My heart was in my throat as I listened to how they were, in effect, made orphans by Russian soldiers who killed or imprisoned their parents, and also some of the bombing sites. Putin has intensified the frequency and magnitude of his bombing of civilians, whole neighborhoods decimated. And so this war has peace nowhere in sight, and we need to supply the kind of resources Ukraine needs to continue the fight. Their fight is really our fight, because Putin will keep going against NATO, and we will be obligated to become more involved, possibly with troops on the ground, if Putin is allowed to overrun Ukraine.
Sorry, Senator, and that's exactly gets me to your sanctions bill. I mean, there isn't anything in Washington that gets nearly the entire Senate around it. You've got 80+ co-sponsors backing this bill, and these are seen as huge sanctions that would really cripple and hurt the war machine behind Putin's attack on Ukraine. The president has not endorsed this move. Again, yesterday, has not endorsed the sanctions bill. Is President Trump bulking on these sanctions? If so, why?
One of the mysteries to me, Kate, and your question goes to the heart of Putin, in effect, playing Donald Trump. He's making a fool of him. And I have no good answer for why Trump has failed so far to endorse explicitly this bill, but he's talked about sanctions, and you're absolutely right. 82 senators are co-sponsors. They are supporters on the record of this bill. 41 Democrats, 41 Republicans, and we are going to have more join us, possibly as a result of the briefing today. And in the House, there is the same overwhelming majority. If this bill gets a vote, it will pass. Speaker Johnson said he's in favor of sanctions. So Donald Trump, I think, really is inexplicably inert, I'll put it kindly, on this bill, even as Putin continues to thumb his nose at him and play him for a stooge.
Well, I mean, just to put a fine point on it, I mean, this is of recent the most perfect example of how Washington is these days. I mean, this bill is backed by nearly the entire Senate. It has support in the House of Representatives. And everyone's saying it will have an impact on something that is in U.S. interest, yet it still is facing uncertain odds in Washington. I mean, how far through the looking glass can you get?
And I think the American people deserve action on this bill. Our national interests and our security are involved. It is also, let's be very blunt, aimed at China, who is one of the major purchasers of Russian oil and other energy goods. The sanctions bill says, in effect, if you buy Russian oil and gas and uranium, your products will be subject to a 500% tariff coming to the United States. 70% of all those energy products are bought by India and China. This bill says to China, if you continue to support Russia's war machine, you'll pay a price. And so it can be viewed not just as aimed at Putin and Russia, but also at China, who have profited from this war, even as the people of Ukraine are sacrificing blood and financially the destruction of their country.
It'll be very important to hear how senators react when they leave that briefing that you and Lindsey Graham have coordinated for them after your trip. Thank you so much, Senator, for coming in.